sacred Chokang temple. When they reached there, the monks at the temple burst into tears. Risking their lives, the monks told journalists both in Chinese and in Tibetan languages, "We don't have freedom. People offering prayers and prostrating in this Chokang temple are all cadres planted by the Chinese government. The recent demonstrations in Tibet had nothing to do with His Holiness the Dalai Lama." China's blatant lies and baseless accusations against His Holiness the Dalai Lama were thus exposed, placing the Chokang monks in great danger. Beginning from this year's March 10th anniversary, Tibetans from the 3 traditional provinces of Tibet, including in the capital Lhasa, participated in peaceful demonstrations against the Chinese government. These demonstrations were a clear indication of the Tibetan people's deep resentment and anger against China's intolerable repression and occupation of Tibet. The Chinese government, however, claimed that the demonstrations were participated in only by a handful of what it refers to as Tibetan separatists. They then went on a propaganda drive, claiming that the majority of Tibetans are satisfied and live a life of happiness and prosperity. In the recent protest, Tibetans from the 3 traditional provinces spontaneously expressed their pent-up desires and aspirations, consequently contradicting and exposing China's never-ending propaganda and lies. In other words, Tibetans expressed in clear terms to the entire international community what their aspirations really are. Some of the reliable and confirmed reports that we received are as follows. Tsering, a monk student at the Kriti monastery, witnessed the series of demonstrations participated by Tibetans throughout the Amdo region of Tibet. He explains.
Dan domi choga ni mamang gelang chimungo ndawo te ta chada niwi tari ni ching ni zong ten go zig yori go zig sa de rab repkung zong la cha de yori repkung zong go mamang ge repkung zong to ni ta ngogo chi mamang de yang kap te du la mamang chig tel ha chig gar de yori.
The Tibetan uprising in the province of Dome began from 21st February 2008. It was in Repkong that protests first broke out. Almost 10,000 Tibetans participated in it, of whom many were arrested. Till today, they have not been released from the prison. In the whole of Tibet, uprisings and protests actually began from 10th March. In the province of Dome, protests began from 14 March and it still continues. The Chinese security forces fired on the protesters and killed many people. The pictures of these massacred Tibetans can be seen by anyone. Apart from these, there are many other Tibetans who died after undergoing severe torture in prisons. For instance, Nejung from Ngaba, Amdo, was arrested on 15 March. She returned home from prison on 26 March. She was denied medical treatment and finally died on 17 April. Though she had a husband, but he fled into the mountains. She had 4 children, of whom 2 were arrested immediately following her death. One of her children, in fact, suffered severe fracture in his hands and legs and had to remain in hospital. The Chinese began implementing a series of patriotic re-education campaigns from 21 March. The education campaigns are primarily about denouncing His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan Youth Congress and singing praises for Chinese government. This is the reason why Tibetans deeply resent the patriotic education campaigns. This is the reason why most of the monasteries remain empty and Tibetan men fled into the mountains and hide there for months. Under such circumstances, Tibetan women have no choice but to participate in re-education campaigns. One thing they can do is protest, which means arbitrary arrest or fleeing into the mountains. Tibetans fled to all parts of Dome. The present situation in Dome is such that most of its areas remain deserted.
Dome chosina chetang posa yonzo la mambo chi rigla tusho che de batan lagbatan dome chokotanda gomba mambo chi na tomba chak de panda ni chirte atanda rang chi tandin chi ponang ni tang te tandi chi la chak de yore.
About the peaceful protests carried out in different ways by the Tibetans in the eastern Tibet Kham region, Geshe Melam Tharchin, who is a member of Tibetan Parliament in exile and the Tibetan Solidarity Committee, said,
감솔 자첨부 중에 나니 감 간지기초 대솔 효침부지 정유래 안된 안식에 직전하게 사자 규제비게 별언정 중 안에 수천 신체 총은 신체 연애 신체 대손으로 유비 감게 종가 가사간에 쉬고 암들
There were numerous protests in Kham areas, including in Kanse. Similarly, mass protests occurred in Tibet Autonomous Region and the remaining Tibetan areas incorporated into the Chinese provinces of Sichuan and Qinghai. The Chinese government tries to show to the international community that the protest occurred only for a single day in Lhasa, that is on 14 March. They call it 314 Lhasa riots and accuse the Tibetans of indulging in looting, arson and smashing. The Chinese government claims that the protests involved only a handful of what it calls Tibetan separatists. This is not true. Both the Tibetan government in exile and Tibetans in and outside of Tibet know that the protests were popular and participated in by the majority of the Tibetan population. I will provide a short account of Tibetans shot dead by the Chinese police, their birthplaces and regions in Tibet, and also about Tibetans who were arrested. I will also tell you about Tibetans who were subjected to what the Chinese government referred to as patriotic re-education campaigns. The Chinese security forces shot dead many Tibetans from the Tibetan areas of Kanse, Sertha, Dango in the Kham province, now incorporated into the Chinese province of Sichuan. There were also instances of Chinese security forces firing on Tibetans in Tau, although we have still not been able to identify the exact number of Tibetans killed in this Tibetan area. Mass demonstrations also broke out in the Kham areas of Dozong, Nyakchuka, Nyarong, Dege, Peyu, Sirshul, Lidang, Padang, Pari, Derong, in which, apart from monks and nuns, young Tibetans, mostly below the age of 18, participated. These protests were severely suppressed, and Tibetans participating in it were subjected to severe torture and repression. As far as the Tibetan Autonomous Region was concerned, protests erupted in areas like Nakchu, Sozong, Diruzong, Dajezong, and so on. All of these Tibetan areas are off limits. In Chamdo itself, one Tibetan was executed. Some Tibetans were chased all the way down to their hometowns and executed there for allegedly participating in the Lhasa protests. Other Tibetan areas where protests broke out include Chonda, Gonjo, Markham, Pakshu. Tibetans in these areas protested in different ways, such as distributing political leaflets, resisting Chinese government's patriotic re-education campaigns, and so on. Like other Tibetan areas, these places also remain under severe restrictions and are off limits. Tibetan areas in Qinghai province were also rocked with protests involving Tibetan students. The Chinese security made a lot of arrests there. Other Tibetan areas in this province were firmly kept under control. In Yunnan's Dejian Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture, many leaflets were seen pasted on the walls, with the Chinese putting severe restrictions in this area. In Nyingti, the Chinese put many obstructions and restrictions in the way of Tibetans who wanted to collect Yaza Gumbu. The Chinese warned the Tibetans not to assemble in groups for fear that protests would erupt spontaneously. There are also many other Tibetan areas where demonstrations broke out. We are not able to identify them at the moment. In the whole of Tibet, including in Kham, demonstrations of different manifestations broke out this time.
Similarly, protests by monks and nuns from the monasteries and nunneries of Sharbum, Chokor, Pangsa, Drachi, Diruvangten, and Rutok in the province of Utsang were brutally crushed by the Chinese security forces. There were also demonstrations and protests by many Tibetans, most of whom were quite young, behind the Tashilhumbu monastery Shigatse. In order to suppress these demonstrations, the Chinese security forces used tear gas to disperse the crowd and arrested around 40 Tibetans. On 9th April 2008, the Chinese government allowed another selected group of journalists to visit traditional Tibetan provinces of Kham and Amdo, now incorporated into the Chinese provinces of Qinghai, Sichuan, Yunnan, and Gansu. The visit was meant to show the world that peace and stability had returned to these Tibetan areas. When the journalists arrived at the Labrang Tashiki monastery, around 20 monks holding the Tibetan national flag shouted out, "We hoped the Chinese government would invite His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Tibet. We are not demanding independence for Tibet. We are demanding human rights and religious freedom. We don't have human rights." In this moving way, the monks laid bare the true situation of Tibet and exposed China's lie and propaganda to the international community that Kham and Amdo enjoyed peace and stability. On 29th April 2008, the so-called Lhasa Intermediate People's Court sentenced 30 Tibetans, including Pasang, Tsering, and Sonam Tsering, for 3 to 14 years of rigorous imprisonment for indulging in what the Chinese call the 3.14 Lhasa rights. In reality, these Tibetans, some of whom were sentenced to life in prison, were merely expressing their wishes through peaceful protest. The swift and severe nature of the sentence showed that the Chinese government were not following the due judicial process as prescribed in its constitution, but rather carrying out the orders of Tang Jingli, secretary of the so-called Regional Communist Party of the Tibet Autonomous Region, who said, "We must strike hard by making immediate arrest. They should be immediately interrogated and sentenced." Thus, Tibetans who were making known their views through peaceful protest were falsely accused of illegal activities and brutally suppressed. They were denied the right to hire independent lawyers and defend their cases as prescribed in the Constitution, and were sentenced by sheer force without any regard to normal legal procedures stated in the Chinese Constitution. Regarding this, Jampel Merlam, Deputy Director of the Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy, a human rights monitoring agency based in Dharamsala, India, says,
If we look at the 30 Tibetans sentenced in Lhasa, we would know how swiftly the Chinese carried out their judicial proceedings. Within a short span of time, one Tibetan was sentenced to life in prison. Others were sentenced to 20 years of rigorous imprisonment. Even the judicial proceeding of the Lhasa Intermediate People's Court was illegitimate, as it didn't follow the norms of the Chinese legal system. From the perspective of the Chinese judicial system, before sentencing a person, one has to go through a series of legal procedures. After arresting a person, the police should conduct its investigation, which would take several days to complete. Permission from the People's Procuratorate is also needed to conduct investigation and interrogation, which would take some time. Finally, the court delivers its verdict. In short, it takes time to sentence a person. In the case of the 30 sentenced Tibetans, such a procedure was not followed. Their sentence was carried out immediately within a month and few days. Such a swift sentencing of Tibetans showed Tibetans were not given a fair trial. The Tibetans were also denied the right to hire independent lawyers to defend their cases. The Chinese state media claimed that the Tibetans were allowed to hire lawyers, but in reality, the lawyers were not independent, they were mere stooges of the Chinese government. Secondly, the 30 Tibetans were sentenced illegally as they didn't commit any crimes. The Tibetans were protesting peacefully. merely exercising their basic human rights. They were exercising freedom of speech by protesting peacefully, all in accordance with statutes of international human rights law. The Chinese government, however, accused and sentenced them for committing serious crimes of what it calls smashing, looting, and burning. For instance, Awang Inye, a monk from Digung Monastery, participated in a peaceful protest on 17th March, but the Chinese government sentenced him for indulging in crimes of looting and smashing. The Chinese government was doing everything in its capacity to change the peaceful nature of Tibetan protests into incidents of loot, arson, and violence. Of the 30 Tibetans sentenced by the Chinese government, not a single Tibetan was given a fair trial. All of them were sentenced harshly and denied justice. Until 1997, the Chinese constitution branded people involved in political activities as counter-revolutionaries. But since then, some amendments have been made in the constitution, and as a result, those who participate in political activities such as demonstrations and hold dissenting views have been regarded as criminals endangering state security. In short, the sentence meted out to the 30 Tibetans was illegitimate as it didn't follow the due judicial process. In particular, Tibetans were sentenced for crimes which they even didn't commit.
Lenin, the ideologue of communism, once said, "The policy of exploiting nationalities is the policy of breaking up the unity of the nationalities. Separatism among the nationalities is caused by the policy that exploits the nationalities." Similarly, Mao said, "Where there is oppression, there will be rebellion." The series of demonstrations in Tibet were caused by the Chinese government's intolerable repression in Tibet. The denial of basic human rights, religious freedom, and in particular, denunciations of the person of His Holiness the Dalai Lama during the so-called patriotic education campaigns conducted for years in monasteries and nunneries were the powder keg that triggered off these protests. During his state visit to Laos, Chinese Premier Un Jabao said His Holiness the Dalai Lama should use what Un calls his influence to stop the protest in Tibet. Had the Chinese government been sincere in preventing the protest in Tibet, it would have responded positively to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who appealed them to immediately halt their violent crackdown, release the arrested protesters, and give medical care to those injured in the demonstrations. Only by beginning peaceful Sino-Tibetan dialogue and granting meaningful autonomous rights to the Tibetans can China enhance its positive image in the international community and stamp out the roots of separatism among the nationalities. Otherwise, it is not impossible to see another pro-democracy Tiananmen-style protest across China, considering that Tibet's peace and stability are closely intertwined with that of China itself. The Chinese government launched a brutal crackdown on the protest in Tibet, through which Tibetans expressed their aspirations and desires long suppressed under years of intolerable Chinese oppression. Leaders of the free world, including the President of the United States and non-governmental organizations across the world, expressed their concern and solidarity to the Tibetans inside Tibet. They pressured and appealed to the Chinese government to hold peaceful talks with His Holiness the Dalai Lama to resolve the issue of Tibet. On 12 May 2008, a series of earthquakes rocked many areas of China's Sichuan province. According to information released by the Chinese state media, more than 69,019 people died and around 3,700,000 were injured in the devastating earthquakes. A further 18,627 people went missing and 15.15 million were displaced. In short, more than 10 million people were affected by the earthquakes. In order to express solidarity with and sympathy for the victims of the earthquakes, the Central Tibetan Administration organized a prayer ceremony at the Tsuklakang Temple. Led by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the prayer ceremony was participated in by all the staff of the Central Tibetan Administration and thousands of Tibetan people, all of whom prayed that victims receive all relief and assistance from the international community. Despite the tragic turn of events, the Tibetans all over the world hope for peace to reign in Tibet and China.